2020 is a special year. So one of the first things I thought of doing was to take a step back, right back to 2000 to date, to see how we've performed in each of those election years. In 2000, we planned that we're going to have a budget deficit of 6.1%. We ended up doing about 8.5. So the percentage change there was about 40%. Then in 2004, we planned 1.7, we did 3.2. We ended up close to 90% overrun on our budget deficit. In 2008, the interesting thing is that we did close to 2 times what we planned in excess. So we wanted to do about 4. We ended up doing close to 12% budget deficit in 2008. Fast forward 2012, we ended up doing an excess of about 80%. 2016, we ended up doing about 64%. And of course, those arguments will come back whether you're talking about cash or committal basis, but I'm not going to go into those conversations. The takeaway point was that in each of those years, we ended up going above what we planned by about 50% to almost 200%. 2020, we are planning to do 4.7. The question is, what would we do at the end of the year? What makes 2020 an interesting year is that government's position is that now I have a Fiscal Responsibility Act. And of course, the finance minister was on news for over the weekend, clearly saying that if he goes over that, his job potentially could be on the line. So now we have a Fiscal Responsibility Act, which ordinarily says that you should not go beyond 5% until there is a reason or there's an emergency for we to accept you going beyond that 5%. So the graph over there basically shows us what we've done in each of those election years. And an election year also confronts us this year. Now, our moderator for the day was clear. We are planning to spend about 86 billion, excluding amortization of our debt in 2020. We are going to raise revenues of about 67 billion. Now, if you invite a tax partner to talk about the revenue side of this topic, then of course expect that I'll be very biased towards taxes. And the reason is simple. Out of that revenue basket of about 67 billion, taxes is planned to be about 49.2 billion, or roughly about 73% of that collection for 2020. In other words, if we're not going to take anything out of today's conversation, just remember that GRA plans to raise about 50 billion for 2020. Truth of the matter is that the 50 billion would have to come from you and have to come from me. And we need to talk about innovative ways to ensure that at the end of the day, we are able to raise that sufficient revenue to be able to put up the kind of hospitals you and I deserve, the kind of roads you and I want to drive on, the kind of security you and I want. So having established the fact that I'm talking about the revenue side, and I'm going to be focusing on the tax bit, which contributes about 73% of what we attempt to raise, what is the solution framework that I would propose for 2020? Now, one of the things that you have seen from the graph is that year on year, we'll be running a budget deficit. But the natural question that comes up is that why are we unable to raise the kind of revenues that we seek to raise on an annual basis? Some observation, we are saying that if governments, if the people are assured that one, we contribute and we'll have our contributions protected, then we can always go back to ask for more. Because the natural question that you always have anyone ask is that, what has happened to all the contributions that I have done in the past? So that you may not see it a lot in the corporate world, but if you go to our markets and you ask them to contribute, what they're going to be telling you is that what we have contributed in the past, what and how has this benefited us? So before we share those innovative ways to raise revenue, the very first point we want to say is that until and unless the citizens are encouraged and motivated and reassured that the purse is being protected and protected well, we will still have challenges when it comes to revenue generation. The second point that we want to share as a framework is that last year or last 2 years, we were all in this country when a segment of our society said that they were only going to start paying taxes if they were educated. And I wish we could all jump onto that and also say that we have not been educated properly, so we're not going to pay taxes. So the second thing that we're going to share to government is help take away those excuses that have not been educated. Because if I've not been educated, and that will serve as an excuse, then everyone would want to raise the education as an excuse. The third bit is on systems. So the question is, how can I easily pay my taxes? Do I need to join the traffic to get to the tax office, and when I miss that deadline, I incur penalties and interests? If we want people to comply, and for us to raise the relevant taxes that we want in this country of ours, we need to ensure that the systems are adequately working. If I need a tax clearance certificate, can I just walk to the GRA? The GRA goes through its files and then indeed confirm that I am worthy of that certificate, or would I be asked to bring copies of all the returns that I've filed over the years before the tax clearance certificate is issued? 4, the question is, if I can actually get away with my wrongs, there is a motivation to keep getting away and doing the wrong things. So to what extent have we enforced the tax laws in the past? And actually, people hold a view that when I walk to the tax authority to tell them that I am starting a new business, then I would, on that very first day, be given a lot of taxes to pay. Whilst if I don't go there, nobody chases you. To what extent are we going to address these issues around enforcement? The last bit is on trusts. So do government itself trust the people to discharge their duties? And do we really trust government to really use the tax laws that they have actually passed fairly? So these are the questions, and this is the framework that we want to share with you as we get ready to get into the conversation around increasing our tax revenues. And indeed, for those of you who are monitoring, what I've essentially done is to spell the word reset. So if you are reassured, if we are educated, if the systems are right, if the laws are going to be enforced, and there is trust, then yes, you and I can begin talking about the tax revenues that we want to raise. My final agenda point would be on sharing some ideas. But before that, I wanted to recollect something that the president said in 2019 at the State of the Nation's address. He said, revenue mobilization poses the biggest challenge in the managing of our economy, with tax exemption policies in particular being my headache. So this comment was made in the 2019 State of the Nation's address. 2 days from today, we'll have another State of the Nation's address. And what would be the biggest economic management challenge of the government? You and I can only guess at this stage. But then indeed, one of the things that the president mentioned last year was that exemptions was a headache. So I'm going to touch on exemptions as I go forward. Also, the minister clearly said in the 2020 budget that there's going to be a number of reforms when it comes to the tax base. So I would also talk about those reforms as I seek to share some ideas on how we can generate revenue. Now, the ideas that we're going to share has been placed in these 6 categories. The first being implementation, and I will explain that. The second being on value-added tax. I'll come back to talk about that. The third being the informal sector, the sector you and I have struggled to touch in the past. The fourth being things on sustainable development goals. the fifth being time value of money, which I'll come back to explain, and the last being simplification. Now, there is nothing innovative about raising tax revenues if the policies that you have talked about, the laws that you have passed, cannot and have not been implemented. So the first one, which is an implementation, whenever the conversations around taxing the e-commerce comes up, I sometimes ask myself, why are we doing this to ourselves as a country? In 2013, we passed a VAT Act known as Act 870. And in that act, we specifically said that for some non-resident that provide e-commerce to persons in this country of ours called Ghana, we're going to charge some VAT. That law came into force on the 1st of January 2014. And if you take account with me, the whole of 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Even the good books tells us that under 70, the deaths of people should be cancelled. If you have passed a law, and for 7 years, we have done virtually close to nothing in terms of publicly available information to touch that segment, then the question I ask myself is, did we really think through properly when passing those laws? Or is it because we had seen the global world or the global economy go a particular direction along what we call the BEPS project? We also wanted to do the same. The question is, if we have things in our law which we are not passing, you create a lot of doubt and uncertainties in the mind of people who have to do it. Now, the question that some of you may raise is that why are we not enforcing this? Now, in tax, the two main taxes that you may have is what we call income tax and VAT. Now, you may be liable to VAT, but not liable to income tax. The current laws and the current practice in this beautiful country of ours is that if I want to register for VAT, I need to go to the tax office and provide some information, including sketching where my office is located. And in addition to that, I need to submit certain documents, certificates of incorporation, and previously, commencement certificates. That non-resident, if they are going to sketch any place, would be beyond the seas, not in Ghana. That's the starting point. And the documents that they will provide are not documents issued by your registrar of companies or your registrar general's department. So therefore, when they go to the GRA, they actually cannot even register. So the question is, why should we pass a law for close to 7 years and we have taken absolutely, publicly, absolutely no effort in implementing that? Second point, we kept complaining as a country that there was a lot of VAT fraud. I can go and walk into some place and they'll ask you the question, do you want VAT or do you want VAT? And at the end of the day, what happens is that last year we even saw a case where a Chinese-led company, certain persons were arrested because of VAT fraud. So you walk in, you get your VAT invoice, but as a right, there are certain things, so it doesn't get onto the counter for in the manner in which it was written. They were arrested. Because of that, 2 years ago, we said we were going to introduce what is called a fiscal electronic device. And what that basically meant was that when you are issued VAT invoices using that device, by the close of the day, the GRA should have an indication of the sales that you have made on that day. So by the time an audit is carried out on you, GRA has a fair idea of the amount of VAT invoices that you have issued. This law was passed in 2018. And one of the good things about this particular law was that there was now a commencement date, which meant the GRA was going to tell us when the law would come into force. 1.5 years down the line, this law is still gathering dust and yet to be implemented. And one thing available suggested that they dealt with it from the top. We passed the law in 2013, once again, the VAT law, saying that ministries, agencies, government bodies, that does things that a private person should do, and meet the VAT registration threshold, and for the sake of the audience here, in general, if your taxable supplies exceed 200,000 over a 12-month period, the laws of the land require you to walk to GRA if you're making a taxable supply and ask to be registered. The GRA could choose to register you or otherwise. What have we done? We have passed a law which says that if the MMDAs are doing things that private businesses are doing and they meet the VAT registration threshold, they should be charging VAT. 6-7 years down the line, I am yet to identify any MMDA that has complied with this provision of law. The question is, if we don't want it in our law, let's just remove it. The laws are for us, and we are not for the law. So the question is, if you have all these things in the law, the issue is, are you really keen on enforcing the laws as you have it? The last point I would like to raise on implementation is exemptions bill. And remember, I just said the president at the State of the Nation's address in 2019 clearly said that his main headache, one of the reasons why when Auntie Rebecca cooks local rice and he cannot eat it freely, is because exemptions and things are giving him headache. We promised, and it was clearly stated in our Article 4 consultation in 2018 to the IMF, that we're going to submit that bill to Parliament for consideration in June 2018. We are in February 2020, and nothing has been done about it. And before that, I remember very well in March 2019, Parliament actually requested people to submit a memoranda on that bill. Submissions were done. The deadline for that memoranda was 5th April 2019. Let's count from 2019 till date. We have gone about 10 months, and publicly, nothing shows that anything is going to happen to those exemptions bill. So the first point I want to make here is that there is nothing innovative if you cannot implement the laws and the plans and the commitment that you make to do. The second innovative thing I want to talk about is on VAT. Truth of the matter, and I am happy with what the MD for Daily Graphics said, we need to have a constructive conversation. The truth is that our VAT system is no longer a proper VAT system. Over the years, we have disturbed how a VAT system must work and created a VAT system which is a lot disturbing. Before the close of this session, I want to throw out a question. If I begin selling shawarma and I make 200,000 Ghana cedis or 250,000 Ghana cedis, when we close, please give me the answer on what the VAT rate on this shawarma should be. We should not create a system that creates a lot of doubt on simple transactions as this, because what you end up doing is that if the system is complicated, we all go for the line of least resistance, which may not be in line with what Parliament intended, and provided my friends at the Ministry of Finance are doing proper budgeting, they would give an expectation which we would never meet. So we've created a VAT system which denies persons inputs, which is actually anti-productive, and not even in line with the 2016 manifesto of the NPP government. For those of you who want to go and look up the manifesto, what the manifesto said was that we're going to introduce the VAT flat rate for small and micro businesses. To my mind, small and micro can be best defined in terms of revenue limits, not in terms of the chain that you are currently operating. So how it works now in Ghana is that you are required to charge 3% VAT if you are making a supply of tangible goods and you are either a wholesaler or a retailer. This is overly and unnecessarily complicated. Reason, if I decide to dispose of, let's say I provide professional services and I decide to dispose of my iPad, the question is, in terms of that disposal, am I a retailer or a wholesaler? Should I be charging 3%? Should I be charging 12.5%? So a system whereby even telling you what the standard VAT rate is, whether it is 12.5, whether it's effectively 17.5, whether it's effectively 18.125, is unduly complicated. If the intent is to make our small and micro businesses pay flat rates, there is nothing better than defining it by virtue of threshold. If you don't meet this level, you operate the flat rate. If you exceed this level, you do otherwise. The next thing I want to talk about, which is an innovative way, is that we have introduced what is called a withholding VAT mechanism. At the time we introduced that VAT mechanism, the rate was 7%. Am I in agreement with that introduction? Yes, because of the nature of our economy. Our economy is so informal, and therefore withholding mechanism is the best way to raise revenue, because you cannot expect everyone to go and file. So what do? We initially introduced that as 7.5. Now, when we brought down the standard VAT rate to 12.5 from the effective rate of 17.5, if we're consistently looking at our tax policies, there is no better way than to reduce that rate and get businesses to reinvest, build the tax base, and pay a lot more revenue. So second action point, second innovative way, let us apply and introduce a VAT system that works and that is not unduly complicated as we currently have. The third bit, which is a section we all want to shy away from, especially in a year like the 2020, is the informal sector. That sector, arguably, controls a large chunk of our GDP. But if you look at their contribution to tax, it breaks the heart. If you take a look at our recent budgets, if you compare the taxes that you and I pay as employees to what we generate from the informal sector, everyone in the formal sector contributes between 15 to 17 times of the equivalent person in the informal sector. So if our GDP base has a lot more contribution from the informal sector, but they are contributing 1/17 of what you and I contribute, then we'll continue to have issues around revenue mobilization. Now, when I talk about informal sector, I'm not talking about those who don't put on ties. If you also have things in your car boot which does not appear on your tax returns, you are part of that informal sector, which potentially causes those in the formal sector to carry a relatively much more portion of the weight. So what are the proposals along this informal sector? I was taking a look at the schedule that we have in our income tax regulations. And it would interest you to know that somebody can do a trotro business, and the whole year, the tax that the person pays will probably not exceed 60 Ghana cedis a year. Check on your pay slip and let me know when you last paid a tax of 60 Ghana cedis. But they use the road a lot more than you and I use the road. And an innovative suggestion that we have in this case is for us to introduce indexation. So what are we saying here? Every year, let us increase what we have in those schedules. So we can decide to say, as a country, it's been difficult taxing the informal sector. So on a year-by-year basis, we would increase the schedules that we have by about 10% to be able to get a lot more. Other suggestions that I would like to make, and of course I'll make them during the panel discussion, is that we need to develop measures that ensures that indeed we want to support the SGDs. So if you are into plastics or you are into anything that is not supporting the economy, we could potentially raise a lot more revenue by having a lot more taxes come on you. But the question once again will go back, what have we even done with the plastic fund that was set up a number of years ago? Another thing that we need to look at in terms of the innovative space is that a lot of government revenues are locked up in disputes. And I'm sure if I'm going to ask a question here, a lot of you will raise your hands that you are having a lot of disputes with the revenue. So in 2018, government clearly said that there was going to be an alternative dispute resolution mechanism to settle tax disputes. We are in 2020, 2 years down the line. That budget promise has yet to see the light of day. And then finally, the last point I will make is that our tax laws, especially for the informal sector, and remember, we need to take away those excuses, it's unduly complicated. So for example, if I am in the informal sector and I employ somebody, you're asking me to go through the tax bands, which are 6 currently. The person will give you every excuse why they cannot go through. Can we reduce those tax bands to about 3 of them instead of the 6 that we currently have? So let me lay down this as the ideas for the conversation and then share a lot more when we go into the details.